In American history, the system of racial discrimination has left deep scars on the soul and society. Although the civil rights movement has made significant progress, and the law has recognized equality for all people regardless of skin color, underlying prejudices still smolder within society. The story that unfolds on Flight 714 from New York to California serves as a quintessential example of how these prejudices still persist. On the surface, it is just a normal flight, but as soon as baseless suspicions are sown, it quickly becomes a vivid demonstration of how prejudices can harm and divide people. As Sarah Blake boarded Flight 714, her eyes quickly scanned the rows for her seat. A fleeting sense of relief washed over her when she noted the flight wasn't overly crowded, but this feeling vanished the moment her gaze landed on the seat next to hers. Seated beside her was a black man with a simple appearance, his jacket slightly wrinkled and a small bag placed under his feet. Sarah paused, her eyebrows knitting together in concern. She looked at Daniel King, then glanced around quickly as if hoping for another open seat. But there was no other option. Why do I have to sit next to someone like this? She thought to herself, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. Every movement Daniel made, from how he quietly arranged his belongings to his bending down to check his bag, seemed to irritate Sarah. She approached her seat reluctantly, placing her bag down heavily, as if to send a clear message. She was not pleased with this arrangement. When Daniel courteously moved to let her into the seat, Sarah merely nodded coldly, avoiding his gaze as if she didn't want to look at him anymore. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Sarah's dissatisfaction grew. The thought of having to share this confined space with a lesser person made her discomfort reach its peak. She pulled her coat tightly around her, creating an invisible barrier between herself and Daniel, as if distancing herself slightly would make her feel safer. In Sarah's mind, deep-seated prejudices suddenly resurfaced, causing her to conjure up an unfounded image of danger from the man sitting next to her. She sat rigidly, staring straight ahead, her mind filled with prejudiced thoughts. He's definitely going to cause trouble. I must watch every move he makes. Negative emotions continued to dominate Sarah, shaping her entire perception of Daniel even before anything actually happened. The flight had only just begun, but in Sarah's mind, it was already an uncomfortable journey, all because of the baseless prejudices she harbored against the man sitting beside her. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the passengers began to relax. The steady hum of the engines became a familiar background noise, muffling the soft murmurs of conversation throughout the cabin. Sarah Blake, with her usual elegant demeanor, leaned back in her seat and took a sip of wine served by the flight attendant. Out of habit, she reached for the diamond necklace around her neck, a piece of jewelry that held not only significant monetary value, but also deep personal meaning. But to her shock, her hand met only empty space. Sarah frowned and sat upright. Her fingers moved around her neck again, this time more quickly and firmly, as if to ensure she wasn't mistaken. The necklace was no longer there. Her heart raced. Panic crept into her mind, quickly turning into fear. This can't be happening, she thought. Sarah glanced around her seat, bent down to check the floor, but found nothing except her compact handbag. In an instant, her eyes darted to the man sitting next to her, Daniel King. He sat quietly, engrossed in the book he held, his hands resting near the small bag beneath his feet. In Sarah's panicked mind, that simple action immediately appeared suspicious. Could it be? Sarah wondered, her heart pounding even harder. She looked at Daniel again, her suspicion now clearly evident in her gaze. He must have taken it, she silently concluded. Unable to remain silent any longer, Sarah exhaled sharply and pressed the call button for the flight attendant, her eyes never leaving Daniel. The fear of losing her precious item, combined with her unconscious bias, began to drive her thoughts and actions. I can't let this go, she resolved. I have to do something. Daniel King, with his usual calm demeanor, sat upright in his seat, his eyes focused on the book in his hands. The gentle sound of pages turning seemed entirely detached from the tense atmosphere spreading throughout the cabin. Sarah Blake, sitting right next to him, couldn't stop stirring up the situation. Her voice was loud and agitated as she spoke to Emily. He took my necklace. I'm sure it was him. You have to check right now? But Daniel, as if he hadn't heard a word from Sarah, continued to turn the pages of his book, his eyes fixed as though the accusations weren't directed at him. To him, this was just another flight like any other, and he saw no reason to be concerned with the growing fury of the woman beside him. Emily, trying to remain calm under the pressure of Sarah's accusations, glanced at Daniel, hoping for some sort of response. Yet Daniel neither looked up nor said a word, nor did he appear affected. He simply lowered his book slightly to reach for the glass of water on the tray table, took a sip, and resumed reading, as if Sarah's accusations were happening somewhere far away and didn't involve him at all. Daniel's composed demeanor not only infuriated Sarah, but made her feel as though she was being challenged. He doesn't even care, Sarah exclaimed to Emily, her voice breaking with frustration. Don't you see how suspicious that is? He's pretending to be calm, to cover up his guilt. Daniel still didn't say anything, quietly turning another page. If he was focused on anything at that moment, it was not letting himself get swept up in the baseless anger of a stranger. For him, proving his innocence wasn't something he needed to do, at least not by arguing with Sarah. He clearly has nothing to say because he knows he's guilty. Sarah escalated the situation even further. A few passengers began to take notice, their curious and skeptical gazes turning toward Daniel. Finally, Daniel slowly closed his book, placed it on the tray table in front of him, and looked directly at Emily. Can I help you with something? He asked, his voice calm, steady, and entirely free of tension. The simple question, delivered in a soft but confident tone, took both Emily and Sarah by surprise. Daniel's composed reaction, instead of making him appear suspicious, caused some passengers to start questioning whether something was truly amiss. Not with Daniel, but with Sarah. Sarah, her face flushed red with anger, raised her voice even louder to repeat her accusation. He took it. I'm sure he stole my diamond necklace. Emily Scott, the flight attendant, maintained her composure as she tried to de-escalate the situation. Ma'am, please calm down. We will check your seat area thoroughly before drawing any conclusions. However, Sarah refused to relent. She stomped her foot and insisted, It has to be him. I demand that you check his bag immediately. This necklace is very valuable. He must have hidden it. Sarah's words echoed throughout the cabin, drawing the attention of many passengers. Murmurs began spreading. A woman sitting in the opposite row whispered to her companion. She seems so certain. Honestly, he does look a bit suspicious, always reaching into his bag since the flight started. A middle-aged man sitting in the row ahead turned slightly, frowning as he cast a scrutinizing look at Daniel. If he didn't do anything wrong, why wouldn't he let them check his bag? Amidst the skeptical whispers, a few passengers grew visibly uncomfortable with the unfolding situation. A young man shook his head slightly and said loud enough for those nearby to hear, This is ridiculous. She's just making things up. The guy was just sitting there, minding his own business. Daniel, still seated upright, worked hard to maintain his composure. However, the stares of the surrounding passengers felt like daggers piercing him. He could sense the rising suspicion, and the prying eyes made him feel more uncomfortable than Sarah's accusations ever could. Emily, recognizing the growing tension in the cabin, stepped in to regain control. She addressed the passengers firmly. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. I understand your concerns, but we need to handle this matter calmly and follow proper procedures. Thank you for your cooperation. The silence that followed was short-lived. A nearby woman couldn't hold back and whispered to her friend, though loud enough for Daniel to hear. I don't want to judge, but he does look suspicious. Maybe she's right. The murmurs continued to ripple through the cabin, creating a stifling atmosphere. Daniel let out a sigh, his hands gripping the armrests tightly, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He tried his best to keep his frustration from surfacing, though he knew he had done nothing wrong. The weight of being surrounded by judgmental eyes was an unbearable burden. Emily, sensing the urgency of defusing the situation before it spiraled further out of control, stepped closer to Daniel and spoke in a calm but resolute tone. Sir, I need your cooperation to help settle this matter. Would you allow us to check your bag? Emily, caught between Sarah's pressure and the expectant gazes of the surrounding passengers, could feel the situation slipping out of control. Sarah continued to insist loudly. You need to check his bag right now. Why are you hesitating? If something happens, it will be your responsibility. Despite maintaining her professional demeanor, Emily couldn't deny the tense atmosphere engulfing the cabin. She took a deep breath, turned to Daniel, and spoke in a calm, yet firm tone. Mr. King, I understand how uncomfortable it is to be accused like this, but to resolve the situation and ease the tension, could you allow us to check your bag? I believe this will help clarify everything. Daniel looked at Emily for a moment, his eyes steady but reflecting a quiet displeasure at being placed in such an unjust position. He sighed, put his book down on the tray table in front of him, and said slowly, I haven't done anything wrong, but if it will help everyone feel at ease, I'll cooperate. The passengers around him held their breath, all eyes fixed on Daniel as he calmly reached down to pick up the small bag at his feet. The cabin fell so silent that the sound of the zipper opening was distinctly audible. Daniel carefully took out each item from his bag. A worn leather notebook, a bottle of heart medication, clearly labeled with his name from the pharmacy, a few personal items like pens, a wallet, and a handkerchief. There was no necklace. Emily inspected the items with a professional gaze and then nodded slightly. I don't see any sign of the necklace in his bag, Mrs. Blake, she said, turning to Sarah. Daniel calmly closed his bag, placed it back at his feet, and looked at Sarah with a mixture of exhaustion and disappointment. As I said, he remarked slowly, his tone betraying a hint of weariness, I didn't take anything of yours. At this point, Sarah began to look flustered. A heavy silence filled the cabin as passengers who had initially doubted Daniel now turned their judgmental gazes toward Sarah. Some whispered among themselves, but most waited to see how she would react. Emily, keen to diffuse the awkward situation, spoke gently. Mrs. Blake, we will continue checking the area around your seat. It's possible the necklace fell somewhere nearby. Sarah, though still reluctant to fully accept this explanation, found herself unable to argue further. She sat still, her eyes darting nervously, while Daniel returned to his seat, picked up his book, and resumed reading as if nothing had happened. Sarah, still visibly annoyed and doubtful, pointed at Daniel once more, her voice filled with stubborn insistence. It has to be him. No way. He must have hidden it somewhere. You need to check more thoroughly. I know the necklace couldn't just disappear like that. Emily, trying to remain calm, responded, Mrs. Blake, we've already checked Mr. King's bag and found nothing. I suggest we continue searching the area around your seat. Despite Emily's reassurance, Sarah refused to back down. No, you don't understand. He did something. I'm sure of it. The atmosphere in the cabin grew tense, with murmurs and glances directed at both Sarah and Daniel. Some passengers began to show signs of annoyance, while others merely observed with curiosity. At that moment, a voice from the row behind spoke up. "Excuse me, is this what you're looking for?" All eyes turned to see a middle-aged man sitting behind Sarah, bending down to pick up something shiny from under his seat. It was the diamond necklace. Emily quickly walked over to the man, taking the necklace from his hand with a small smile. She turned to Sarah and asked, "Mrs. Blake, is this your necklace?" Sarah's jaw dropped, her eyes widening as she stared at the necklace. She nodded repeatedly, her voice trembling. "Yes, yes, that's it. That's my necklace." Emily handed the necklace back to Sarah, her expression carrying a trace of restrained disappointment. She spoke gently. "The necklace must have fallen when you leaned over earlier. Thankfully, a passenger was able to find it." Sarah took the necklace, her hands slightly shaking. At that moment, she felt the gaze of the surrounding passengers, judgmental looks that no longer focused on Daniel, but were now entirely directed at her. Daniel, still sitting in his seat, glanced briefly at the situation before returning to his book, calmly reading as though nothing had happened. However, a hint of weariness flickered in his eyes, as if he had grown accustomed to such unjust situations. Sarah lowered her head, avoiding everyone's gaze. A silent shame spread through her heart, but the apology she wanted to give remained stuck in her throat. Emily, maintaining her professionalism, quickly reassured the other passengers and restored normalcy to the cabin. The atmosphere in the plane gradually settled, but traces of tension lingered in the exchanged glances of the passengers. Holding the necklace in her hands, Sarah said nothing further. She quietly sat back in her seat, staring out the window, silently telling herself that this was a lesson she would never forget. Sarah took the diamond necklace from Emily with trembling hands, feeling a mix of relief and embarrassment. She looked at the sparkling necklace in her palm, its brilliance now overshadowed by her guilt. She realized that everything that had just happened was caused by her baseless suspicion, and her actions had created unnecessary tension for everyone on the flight. Sarah glanced up at Daniel, who was still sitting silently in the seat beside her. He didn't look at her, but the calmness on his face made Sarah feel smaller and more regretful than ever. She swallowed hard, wanting to apologize, but the words felt stuck in her throat. Finally, Daniel slowly closed his book, his gaze falling on Sarah, not with anger, but with a calm, firm expression. He spoke, his voice low and steady. "I hope next time you'll think carefully before accusing someone without evidence." Sarah couldn't respond. She simply lowered her head, avoiding his gaze. Daniel's words struck her like a sharp blade, cutting through her pride and leaving her with a deep sense of remorse. The cabin gradually grew quiet, with the surrounding passengers sitting in silence. However, their looks said everything. Disappointment, not in Daniel, but in Sarah. Some shook their heads, while others whispered to one another. Emily, still maintaining her professional demeanor, gently addressed the passengers. "We have resolved the issue. Please relax and enjoy the rest of your flight." Daniel said nothing more. He picked up his book again, his eyes returning to the pages. For him, this wasn't the first time he had faced injustice, but he had always chosen to overcome it with calmness and dignity. Sarah sat quietly in her seat, her eyes looking out the window, overwhelmed by an uncomfortable sense of shame. The necklace in her hands no longer symbolized pride, but instead served as a stark reminder of the lesson she had just learned. Never let prejudice and hasty judgment cloud your reason and compassion. Awkwardly, Sarah looked at Daniel, clutching the necklace tightly, as if seeking some form of solace. She took a deep breath, her eyes meeting Daniel's, still sitting silently, engrossed in his book. For the first time during the entire flight, Sarah felt not only ashamed, but also deeply aware of the injustice she had caused.